Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am just another tinfoil hat. Welcome to my show. Now, today I'm excited to announce that we are traveling back to my fantastically weird home state of Wisconsin with the Wauwatosa Weirdos, or Wauwatosa if you're from Illinois, as I've been told. Now, buckle your seatbelts on for this one and keep your hands and feet in the saucer because this is really one of the truly creme de la creeps in my book. So this bizarre event occurred on November 10th of 1975. Incidentally, this is the exact same date that the Edmund Fitzgerald sank in the icy depths of Lake Michigan, of course forever immortalized in the fantastic song by Gordon Lightfoot. However, in Wauwatosa, a middle-aged couple by the name of Anne and Peter Eelbus were relaxing in their home as the evening drew on, when suddenly, at around 10 minutes to 8, the front doorbell rang. So Anne got up to go see who it was, and she actually peeped through the curtain to get a good look before just throwing open the door. And spoiler alert, it was not a Girl Scout with last call for mint thins. She said that she saw a strangely dressed man standing on the front porch step. And by strangely dressed, she meant that he was wearing this kind of like short brimmed hat. There's this crude illustration of it. It almost looks like one of those like straw pork pie hats or even a gondolier hat, but with a very narrow brim. And that he was even holding this 5-foot-long staff. So upon seeing this figure, for whatever ungodly reason, Anne did decide to open the door. However, she just opened the storm door and immediately locked the screen door and spoke to the visitor through that. Now, as she approached the door, he was standing actually down off the stoop, a good 4 feet away from the front door. After prompting the strange visitor with yes, yes, a couple of times, she called over to her husband saying, "Come over here, he doesn't talk." Now, Pete, who had recently retired from his position as a construction foreman about 2 years earlier, went to the door and upon seeing the figure, apparently said, and I quote, "What the hell is this? Something left over from trick or treat," before unlocking the screen door to get a better look, and possibly throttled the guy on his front porch trying to scare him and his wife. I don't know. So when the screen door was opened and the house lights fell full force upon the visitor's face, Pete was in for quite a surprise. He said that the being had a very pointed chin and a small, tiny, puckered mouth the size of a dime. He also said that the texture of the skin was like smoked meat, that it was lined with deep grooves. It really reminds me of other entity descriptions where people say that it looked like their skin was leathery or plasticky or incredibly wrinkly. The Pascagoula abduction comes to mind immediately with that. Now, Pete also remembered tufts of hair sticking out around either side of the hat. However, perhaps even stranger than what Pete, or Anne for that matter, remembered about their visitor was what they couldn't remember. They say that after they looked away from the face of this strange being, that they just drew a blank on the rest of the features. Now, back to the moment, however, Pete was still thinking this was some sort of leftover from trick or treat, and actually went to grab the supposed prankster, which replied by raising its staff in its left hand and rapping it on the sidewalk. There was a click, 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 and the visitor, as Pete claimed, drifted away from him. So as weird and unsettling and bizarre as a single pork pie wearing, staff holding, smoked meat textured drifting being is, it was at this point that Pete noticed 4 nearly identical beings all over his front lawn. Now, Anne was actually watching from the window at this point, and both she and Pete agreed that these beings appeared somewhat bent, with these bowed legs and claw-like hands. Pete actually referred to them as looking like oversized gnomes. One of these beings bounced mid-air and went into the middle of the street, where it rapped its staff on the road, accompanied again by the clicking noises. Now, Pete described its movements as kind of like astronauts walking on the moon. The 3 other beings simply hovered a few inches above the surface of the lawn. However, they were still making motions as though they were walking. Now, as the initial visitor kind of drifted off to join his cohorts, he actually turned back around and raised his empty, clawed right hand at the couple still staring from the window and the door. Mr. and Mrs. Ilpas claimed that the whole posse hung around for a couple more minutes before drifting away. So it was reported that Pete actually did call the police department, who did send an officer to look for some strange people in the area. However, surprise, surprise, none were found. To sum up any thought of a hoax, Pete had this to say, and I quote, "Besides, the whole thing took about 2 minutes. Who would go to so much trouble for just 2 minutes?" I have to interject here and say that I think almost anyone giving to pranks or hoaxes they would go to a lot of effort for 2 minutes. However, it's a lot more difficult to refute his last word on the topic. And again, I quote, "Besides, how could anyone get people to float all over my lawn?" So obviously, this is a truly bizarre tale, even among fringier encounters. Of course, it's really easy to kind of note the kind of classic Men in Black type seriality of the encounter. A visitor in the evening rings the bell. Said visitor is actually not a person at all, but some strange inhabitant of that uncanny valley between human and human-like. I do find it interesting that Pete's initial knee-jerk reaction was to try and rip off a mask. Given the general impression of the face shape, that of a narrow chin with a small mouth, it's really not too much of a stretch to see a similarity between this being and the infamous grays so heavily associated with the contactee movement. Now, the reason I bring this up is because of the insistence of so many contactees that the beings they observed were not actually the entities responsible or even anything living at all, but rather a mask or disguise for the true experience. Now, of course, in this case, Pete genuinely thought it was a mask, something left over from trick or treat. But it's kind of interesting just to see that connotation again of something truly anomalous in disguise. Now, too, something I'd like to mention. The Flying Saucer Review, when they covered this article, did have an illustration included with the article. And they made sure to note that it likely did not come directly from either one of the witnesses, but likely from a later press illustration. So, as a matter of fact, Pete did produce a few drawings of what he had seen. However, each time he remained faithful to exactly what he did and did not remember. That is, he never gave the entity eyes. I just, again, find this fading of memory immediately after an encounter, immediately after looking away from the anomaly, as being very neatly in line with high strangeness. Now, the stick or staff that the beings were holding really calls to mind, to me at least, a lot of encounters where people claim that decidedly alien entities are holding magical implements like wands. Of course, one of the best examples of this is the infamous frogmen or gnomon of the Honeycutt encounter in Loveland, Ohio. There's also a comparison between the behaviors of these beings and yet another of my previous videos, that of the not-so-standard Sandusky Sasquatch, in which the Bigfoot witness was later harassed by these strange glowing pink beings that effectively walked into his bedroom a few inches above the ground. Again, this just gives a really spectral connotation to these entities. This is not something that is bound by physical laws, it's just kind of interacting with them for a time. It's also especially intriguing that the Ilbas referred to these beings' movements as like that of astronauts walking on the moon. Now, both of them decidedly believed that their encounter was firmly of an out of this world nature. And it's interesting just to see how they framed up the behavior of the beings kind of in that context, while also referring to them as looking like the oh so folkloric gnomes. Well, if you enjoyed this episode on the Wauwatosa Weirdos, be sure to like. And if you're new to this field of crop circles, go ahead and subscribe to see what weirdness the future may have in store. Till then, you can keep up with me on my free blog at patreon.com/justanothertinfoilhat. And for today, I am Zelia Edgar, signing off. Doing.